Hello, my name is Alicia Goodman with the marketing team. Welcome to Fit Teaching, the toolkit for high-quality teaching and learning with Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry. And now a brief introduction to our presenters. Both Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry are professors of educational leadership at San Diego State University and teacher leaders at Health Sciences High and Middle College. They are also both recipients of the Krista McAuliffe Award for Excellence in Teacher Education from the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. Doug Fisher is a member of the California Reading Hall of Fame and the recipient of a Celebrate Literacy Award from the International Reading Association and the Farmer Award for Excellence in Writing from the National Council of Teachers of English. He has published numerous articles and books about improving student achievement. Before joining the university faculty, Nancy Fry was a special education teacher in the Broward County, Florida public schools, where she taught students at the elementary and middle school levels. She later worked for the Florida Department of Education on a statewide project for supporting students with disabilities in the general education curriculum. Nancy is a recipient of the Early Career Award from the Literacy Research Association. Her research interests include reading and literacy, assessment, intervention, and curriculum design. She has published many articles and a number of books on literacy and instruction. ASCD is pleased to welcome Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry.
My name is Nancy Fry.
Hi, it's Doug Fisher.
And we're here today to talk about a framework for intentional and targeted teaching. This is really a culmination of the work of not only ourselves, but of course of lots of other researchers that have come before us. Many of the ideas that have been foundational for us have also, I imagine, been foundational for you as well. Certainly the work of Vygotsky around zones of proximal development has been an important aspect of the work that all of us do in our classrooms, as it leads to practices like scaffolding, like making sure that students are able, through questions and prompts and cues, to reach to and to be able to extend their understanding. The work around gradual release of responsibility, which began with the work of David Pearson and his colleagues around looking at reading comprehension. These are all things that have influenced us. Carol Ann Tomlinson's revolutionary work around differentiated instruction has been vital in helping us to understand the needs of different students and how to meet those needs. Certainly lesson planning, going back to the work of Madeline Hunter as well as others, Ralph Tyler and so on, about how it is that we as teachers communicate with one another through some foundational work in the planning of our lessons. That's been a huge influence for us. And then finally as well, formative assessments, more recent practices around how it is that we can assess what it is that students are doing in order to be able to understand our planning about what to teach next. And then, of course, encompassing all of this is this idea of school climate and school culture. I know from my first days in teacher training that we were always reminded that if students don't know that you care about them, then it's going to be really hard for them to care much about the content at all, that those relationships that we build with our students are absolutely vital to all of the teaching that we do. All of these have been tremendous influences on our work, as I imagine on your work as well. But a question that we have continually asked ourselves is, how do you make this all fit together? These are all absolutely vital practices. We know a lot about all of this, but how do you operationalize that and make that all happen together? And what we've tried to articulate is what we call fit teaching. We talk about a framework, understanding what that framework of instruction is so that we as colleagues can develop a common vocabulary and be able to communicate with one another about our practices, regardless of the content that we teach, regardless of the age of the children that we teach, that we can really communicate clearly what that framework is. In addition, we know that intentionality is essential. Intentionality is essential in the classroom and being able to communicate to students exactly what it is that they're supposed to be learning on a given day, because that intentionality not only signals to our students what it is that they should learn, but it also lets us know and understand what it is that we want to assess for. And we want that learning to be targeted as well. We're going to talk about each of these features and how it is that we see them fitting together.
And it starts with the framework, that having a strong framework for quality instruction is really, really important. We've been working on our framework for instruction since at least 2001. And as Nancy said, drawing on the work of others, but how do we put it together in a cohesive and coherent way? And as we continue this conversation, and maybe some of you will join us in Chicago for 3 days of this conversation at the end of July, as we continue this conversation, how does assessment fit? How does intentionality fit? How do we build a model together that every student, every day, in every classroom gets access to super good instruction? We built our instructional model based on gradual release of responsibility, based on differentiated instruction, to have 4 components. And one of the mistakes that people often make when they see this graphic here is that it's really, that people interpret it as being linear. And it really isn't intended to be linear. You don't have to start at focused instruction and then go guided, collaborative, and independent. It can start anywhere. A perfectly good and appropriate lesson could start with a student-independent task, where students are asked to do something by themselves on their own and be held accountable for it. We could start a lesson with collaborative learning, where students are interacting with one another in thoughtful ways using academic language. So any place to start, anywhere, as long as all 4 of these are accomplished in the lesson. We think there's some closure and some closing the loop that are really important when students need to learn something new. So I'll talk briefly about each of these. For focused instruction, we're really looking at having a clear learning target, learning intention, goal, objective, or purpose. What is it we want students to learn? That also becomes very important in the assessment and the targeted part of this model. You've got to know what we want students to learn. There has to be this intentional target. This is what we're going for today. This is why you're learning this, and this is how we know you have learned it. So part of that focused instruction is being clear on the intention. And then part of that focused instruction is modeling our own thinking. How do we open up our brains and process things out loud with and for students so that they can apprentice to that more cognitive kind of thinking? That takes a lot of work and it's a lot of practice, and we know school systems that spend months and months just on purpose and modeling. But a more cohesive system or approach would include guided instruction. We're going to spend a lot of time on guided instruction when we get together in Chicago. We've written a lot about guided instruction over the years. It's harder. It's a harder part of this, but it's a really important part. It's using prompts and cues and questions to get students to do cognitive work. It's transferring that responsibility. Rather than using a direct explanation, it's really about trying to get something to happen in that student's mind, in that student's brain, for them to notice something. Collaborative learning is student-to-student interaction. It's getting students to talk to each other using academic language and then being held accountable for that as they produce work. We see this as a very commonly missing aspect of high-quality instruction. In fact, most instructional models do not include collaborative learning as an expectation. Some models are only collaborative learning. What we'd like to see is that students are provided opportunities to collaborate, to work, to produce, and to talk every single day, but not that it's the entire class period. They still deserve to know what they're learning. They still deserve to have purpose and modeling. They still deserve to have their errors and misconceptions corrected. We set a goal in our school system that 50% of the instructional minutes are student-to-student interaction using academic language. I was listening to Tim Kano in the math world at a PLC institute not too long ago. And he said to meet the Math Common Core state standards, students need to talk to each other 65% of the instructional minutes. So you're hearing a range of what people are saying is, here's what it's going to take to get there. Somewhere between half of the minutes and 65% of those minutes have to be built around productive and collaborative learning. And as we'll see in a minute, it's the most commonly deleted aspect of our instructional model. The last part is independent learning, where students are asked to try on things by themselves. That may occur in the beginning of the lesson, the middle of the lesson, the end of the lesson, or at home. It's asking kids to develop their automaticity, their fluency, their ability to apply learning to new situations. And carefully crafted independent tasks allow students to do that. It builds their replication and application so they can use the information they've been taught. So we're looking for every single day a clear purpose, teacher modeling, correcting errors and misconceptions, opportunities for students to talk and work and produce, and students being held accountable individually. That probably doesn't sound like rocket science for the first part of our framework, but it just doesn't happen a lot. And it doesn't happen at high enough quality using rigorous curriculum for students to learn. We all could do a needs assessment and say where in our teaching, where in our school are there gaps between what we're currently seeing and what we should be seeing in this framework. A couple non-examples that we see. Sometimes we see this non-example. We call it the sudden release of responsibility classroom, where the teacher models and sets a purpose and does some work in front of students and then turns the students loose to go work independently. There are some kids who learn, or their assessment scores are better. They demonstrate knowledge in this classroom. Those are kids who show up already knowing the curriculum or the content. There's not enough scaffolding in this kind of a classroom or this kind of a lesson for students who don't already know the content. It only really privileges, because there's a huge practice effect, the students who already know the content. Another non-example is students doing school alone. And we call this do-it-yourself school, where students are brought into classes and they're assigned things like read chapter 12 and answer the questions in the back of the book. That's not teaching, that's causing or assigning work. And that's not a complete instructional model. But people know that. Unfortunately, we still see some of that every once in a while, where students are asked to do hours and hours and hours worth of independent work. The most common misapplication of our work is this, where the collaborative learning has been removed. And we talk to people about why that is. And everybody we talk to knows that collaborative learning is important. They know it's useful for students. They know that students should be interacting and producing and talking and thinking. But you end up with concerns about the volume, concerns about the off-task behavior, about the routines, and about one student doing the work for the rest of the students. So we have to spend some time really building confidence and competence with group work. How do we get the students understanding the rules and guidelines and procedures? How do teachers manage that? How do we hold kids individually accountable? That's a big part of the work that has to be done so that we can really build a much more robust instructional framework. We like the word framework because it's not prescriptive or scripted. We have internalized, we've seen teachers internalize that framework and make instructional decisions about what they need to do with students on a daily basis. Unfortunately, in the past, we have seen scripted lessons and prescriptive lessons that remove the teacher's thinking from the lesson. And we're hoping that through fit teaching, people make better decisions based on what they know about the students already.
And you know, Doug, it's really important, too, that for administrators and for instructional coaches that are working with other teachers, and I imagine many of you mentor teachers either formally or informally, it's really important in those mentoring relationships that we have a shared language so that we can talk about our teaching. All of us have seen teachers. We've been fortunate enough to be in the company of teachers who are spectacular in the work that they do. But how do you bring that to scale? How do you make sure that those kinds of practices have the spread of effect that's needed in order to really transform a school? And we believe that that is by being able, in a variety of ways, to clearly articulate what that framework is, which leads us into this idea of intentionality. When we talk about intentionality, we think first and foremost about how it is that we support students, but know that there's another side of that as well, and that is that we want to be intentional in terms of the collegial conversations that we hold with one another as well. When we talk about intentionality, and you can see a definition there on your screen of how Webster defines it, it's an action that's performed with awareness. And we think of the teaching that we do in our classrooms as being very intentional. Things don't happen by accident. We all spend the time that we need in order to be able to plan out how those lessons are going to go. But with all of that careful planning, we aren't always as intentional as we should be in being able to let our students know what it is that we're going for as well. And that's what we mean by establishing purpose. As I said, great teachers have a plan. They know exactly what it is that they're going for. Sometimes we think of that in terms of the lesson's objectives, for example. But when we're talking about establishing purpose, we're really talking about how it is that we translate that into the language of students so that they know what the purpose is. All of us have been fortunate enough to be in the company of children and adolescents who are really just trying to please us, who are really going to be compliant. They'll do what it is that we ask them to do, but they may not understand the why, the purpose, what it is that they're supposed to learn and why it is that they're going to learn it. Using the language of others as well, it's about a clear learning target. We know that, and whether we're talking about inside the classroom or outside the classroom, there's lots of evidence that when you establish what that target is, you increase the likelihood that somebody's going to be able to achieve that target. I imagine many of you have been in the role of being an athletic coach at one time or another in your lives, and you know that in working with the young athletes that you may have worked with, that you're always making sure that they understand and that they see and that they're able to witness what it is that a particular move or a particular play should look like, because when they've got that clear learning target in mind, that you are simply increasing the likelihood that they will actually hit that target. We also hear within our profession the idea around motivation. What is it that's going to motivate students? And this is connected to establishing purpose as well. We believe that a chief way that you motivate anybody, not just students, but anybody, is by making sure that you're building their sense of confidence. Confidence is what motivates. You don't have to be an expert at something, but what all of us need is a sense that we are progressing in whatever endeavor we're undertaking. We need to be able to see that we're making progress in one way or another. That motivates us to try something again, to be able to continue on. That's where we get a sense of resilience and grit in being able to go forward. And when you communicate a clear learning target to students, you are in fact setting forth in front of them what the definition of competence is going to be on that particular day. When we talk about establishing purpose, we talk about within a lesson, what it is that they're going to learn for that particular day. We're not talking about a big, broad standard that may take weeks to achieve, but really focusing them in on what the purpose of the lesson is for today and how it is that they'll know. In other words, we're supporting their goal setting. We're supporting the way in which a student can set a goal for himself or herself, and by the end of the lesson to be able to say, this is what I accomplished today. You're building their sense of confidence day by day, one foot in front of another, so that they persist, so that they continue on.
And being intentional means that you align the activities in the class, the tasks, the assignments, to that purpose. So we think about this. You have a framework. You know what you intentionally want, and you intentionally line it up. And then we have to target students' achievement through formative assessment practices. How do we know who already understands this and who does not yet understand this? So we think about the difference between formative assessment and summative assessment, and we assume people on this webinar know that. We're not talking about summative assessments in fit teaching. Yes, the product of high-quality instruction will be better achievement on summative types of assessments. But we're really talking about, if your teaching is fit, that you understand the role that formative assessment plays in the continuum improvement. We think about some of John Hattie and his colleagues' work and the work we've been doing over the last few years. To build a system that is targeted is not a formative assessment tool, but rather creating a system of processes in place to make sure that formative assessment happens. That requires a very clear purpose and learning target. That requires very good systems for checking for understanding. That requires providing students with feedback about their successes and their needs, and then making instructional decisions about what to do next based on those students' performances. We've done a lot already on the purpose statement, so we'll leave that and really look at checking for understanding. Students knowing how they're doing. How do we know what they're doing? How are they doing? How do they know that? One of the most common ways to check for understanding is through oral language. We ask students to talk to each other and we listen. We ask them to write something on a dry erase board and we listen to them talk about it, and then we look at their dry erase boards. Also nonverbal kinds of language like thumbs up, thumbs down, fistify. There's all kinds of ways of using those language interactions in a classroom for the teacher to know who understands the content and who still needs to be taught that content. We can also use questions to check for understanding. Questions are probably the most common way teachers check for understanding, and there's a lot of use for questions as long as they keep probing for evidence and probing for reasons and going deeper into the thinking behind the response. What we don't want to do is just have students asking recall questions where the teacher has a right answer in his or her mind and that the students just guess what that answer is. We're very interested right now in text-dependent questions and how to get students thinking about questions that require evidence from the text, where they add to their repertoires some ideas of what was the author saying and how is this text working, and going deeper and deeper into those kinds of thinking about a text. We can also use writing to check for understanding. We can have students write quick summaries like exit slips. We can have them write longer pieces. We like to use prompts to drive their writing so that we understand if the student understands what the curriculum and content's about. Writing is doesn't have to be graded as process writing. We can have students write for a few minutes, grab those papers, and take a glimpse of them and say, what do my students know and not know that I need to then teach tomorrow? We can also use projects and performances longer than one class period, but over multiple days to get a sense of students' understanding. And those projects can be paper-based projects, virtual projects, digital projects. There's ideas like getting kids to sustain some of their thinking and their work that allows us to determine where they still need to be taught. Tests can be used for checking for understanding. Often they're considered summative, like end of unit, end of chapter kinds of things. But we could take the results from the test and organize an item analysis and figure out who needs to be taught which things based on the test that we've given. So we can use tests and quizzes formatively, not just summatively. And lastly, we can do common assessments and consensus scoring, where we look across lots of sections of the same course, like all the third graders or all the Algebra 1 students, and say, what is it that the students understand and don't understand? Because we might need to do some grade level or class regrouping to have students master that content again. All that checking for understanding has to be lined up to a purpose statement. What is it that we wanted students to learn, and what data do we have that they did or did not learn that? And as part of that is that framework, coming back from the targeted to the framework, is, and what will I do about it? Do I do whole class? Do I model? Do I guide? Do I do some guided instruction? Do I have kids work collaboratively more? It's really about integrating all of this into our flow of the classroom.
I hope what you're beginning to see, too, is a level of intentionality about all of the practices that we engage in, how it is that we structure our lessons across the day as well as across the year using a framework for quality teaching, as well in being able to establish purpose to really focus students on what it is that they're going to learn about today and what it is that they will do in order to be able to show or demonstrate their growing competence towards that. And then as Doug was talking about, thinking through how it is that we're going to check for understanding. There's a deep connection between purpose and checking for understanding, because when I as the teacher am clear on what it is that I'm going to be teaching that particular day, and I've spent the time considering how I'm going to communicate that purpose to my students, it also clarifies my own thinking about how I'm going to check for understanding and what I'm going to check for understanding about. To extend that further, feedback is a vital part of how it is that we see a fit teaching classroom happening. The feedback that we offer students comes from all of those checks for understanding that we do. It's really addressing that student's question that he or she has in their mind all the time, which is, how am I doing? How am I moving forward? Am I moving closer to that learning target along the way? Feedback is of vital importance. Again, a tremendous amount of research that's been done on feedback. Looking at John Hattie's work, for example, and his meta-analyses around feedback, he's demonstrated how vital it is within a classroom. But we also know, too, that feedback should result in action. Feedback isn't very useful, and unfortunately all of us have been on the receiving end of this. Feedback isn't very useful if there's no actionable item that goes along with that. Perhaps you've seen in your classroom where you've given some written feedback and it goes straight into the waste can. That's a signal that for that student, at least he or she didn't understand or couldn't see what the action might be. So we always have to think about feedback as being actionable. We have to think about and consider feedback that is timely. It's not especially useful if the feedback that students are receiving comes weeks after the event. It just kind of gets stale, and it's hard for them to even turn it into action if too much time has gone past. It also needs to be specific in nature. This, I think, is a real challenge for us in talking with our students as well, because what can occur is that when the student is having more difficulty or is further away from that learning target, very often the feedback gets vaguer. And I know that we may not think that that's the case, but very often it moves towards more and more vague feedback and becomes even more difficult for the student to understand. Often when students are close to the target, our feedback tends to be very specific to them. But when it's further away, we have a harder time in being able to give specific feedback. So note that in your own practice. Pay attention to that. I know that I think about that when I'm giving a student feedback as well. I'm always asking myself the question, is this specific enough? Is it vague enough? I found that it's useful to be able to say to a student after I meet with him or her, so tell that back to me. What's the next thing that you're going to do, so that I can do that check and make sure that they heard the feedback and they got it being really specific. They know what it is that they're supposed to do, which leads us to this idea of being very understandable as well. The feedback needs to be delivered at a level that's developmentally appropriate for the learner, and it needs to be the kind of feedback that they're going to be able to understand. I'm going to steal a story from Carol Jago because I think it's such a wonderful example. Carol Jago is just an exceptional English teacher and has written a lot in the English world. And she talks about an event that happened early in her teaching career where she was writing on students' written work, and one particular student had a lot of fragmented sentences. And for those of you who are English teachers, you know that very often the code for that is to write frag, F-R-A-G, meaning fragmented sentence. But the student in receiving it didn't understand that and thought that what she was writing was frog, F-R-O-G. And so he dutifully inserted the word frog into the sentences that she had marked out and then handed it back to her again. He knew that it didn't make any sense, and was simply trying to do whatever it was that his teacher asked him to do, but there was no understanding that went along with that. And then finally, the feedback needs to be actionable. They need to be able to move on to the next step. And as I said, that's why I think it's really useful to have that conversation with students to be able to review with them. Tell it back to me. What is it that you're going to do next? There are different kinds of feedback that can occur. Some are more useful than others. There are 4 types of feedback. This is the first type. It's feedback about the task itself. This is definitely the most common type of feedback that we deliver as teachers. Sometimes it's referred to as corrective feedback. And when you say, for example, in a student's essay, you're going to want to put a transition between these 2 ideas in your paper, you're giving some corrective feedback. However, it can be less useful if it's not accompanied with additional information that they might need. For example, simply saying to a student, you want to put a transition in here, is not going to be adequate if they don't really have a bank of transitions to be able to draw from. So sometimes they need not only to have that pointed out within the task, but they may need some additional resources to go along with it. The second kind of feedback is about the processing of the task. In other words, the thinking that's going into it instead of simply the task or the product itself. An example of that is in looking at a student who's multiplying some binomials and asking that student, did you use the FOIL method to be able to solve that problem? First, outside, inside, last. A common way of remembering how it is that you multiply binomials. In this particular case, you're asking a question or you're giving some feedback about the thinking, about the cognition that went into that task. A third type is about the student's self-regulation. You know, we're always working toward building students' ability, their capacity to be able to self-regulate. That's an essential part of growing up and maturing when you begin to be able to regulate your own behavior, your own reactions as well. And sometimes some of the feedback that we give is around that self-regulation. Saying quietly to a student, obviously not in front of everybody else, what it is that you observed by saying, for example, I saw that when you put your head down, that you weren't able to listen to the other people in your group anymore. You're giving that student some feedback that's objective and it's observable. You're not saying to the student and attacking their character, but rather what it was that you saw them doing. Another example might be around goal setting. It looks like you really got to achieve what you set out to achieve, right? Again, what you're playing for them or what you're rehearsing for them are some of the same kinds of language that you want them to be able to use internally as well. It can be difficult sometimes for students to be able to replace some of the negative talk that they have in their own heads and replace that with talk and language that is more useful to them. And then the fourth kind is about feedback about them as a person. You have to be really careful about all of this. When you're doing so, you want to do it with this idea of building agency and identity for that student. And again, giving them the language that you hope that they begin to internalize on their own. When you say to a student, I can tell that you really have some great stamina because you've really been working on this for a long period of time. You're giving that student some of that language that they can use. Some of you, I imagine, are in positions where you work with young people who are sometimes really having a difficult time inside and outside of the classroom, that there are other aspects of their lives that are intruding on them. And I have said to students, you know, if you talked to other people the way you talk to yourself, you would have no friends. We really want to go with that idea of building agency and identity and being very careful about the feedback that we offer for students as a person, because we want them to be able to pull in that language and begin to assume that language for themselves about how they talk to themselves. And then finally, there's the feeding forward. In other words, where do we need to go from here? How do we make decisions as teachers about what's going to happen next?
In so many cases, teachers, principals, directors collect piles of information, and we know more about students, their data, their performance than we've ever known. Unfortunately, lots of times we don't have systems in place to do anything about it. It's hard to remember all of the errors and misconceptions, mistakes, and thinking that students make. So we don't do much about it, even though we have the data right there in front of us. To really feed forward, you have to learn about misconception analysis, error analysis, and error coding. Nancy and I have spent some time in the last year really working on the difference between mistakes and errors with a group of teachers. Mistakes we define as when pointed out, the learner knows what to do next. Errors, when pointed out, the learner has no idea what to do next. There's different types of instruction, different needs when the student has made a mistake versus made an error. And we feel like we're wasting a lot of time reteaching mistakes when we should concentrate our time on reteaching errors. So we spend a lot of time with a group of teachers, and now we're getting really good at this. We can get people into like laser in on what was the error, what kind of error was, and what do I do about it. There's a common question in science. How do plants grow? Where does the mass come from? Where's that building block, that mass? And if we're really good on all of our checking for understanding, we will know where students' thinking goes awry. For example, If we took this as a multiple choice, I could have taken it as oral language or written. But let's say I gave students a question, and their responses were cataloged. How many students chose A versus B versus C versus D? Answer A teaches me something about the student's thinking. And I could run an item analysis and say, here are the students who have a misconception. I could run an analysis and say, where are the students who have oversimplification or overgeneralization, and then which kids got this answer right. Students who chose answer A need different next instruction than students who chose B or C. If we're going to use a test formatively, the distractor items should be diagnostic. The distractors should teach us about students' thinking. If we're not using these kinds of items that we can build diagnostically, then we have to keep track of it in some way. If you give A, B, C, D, it's super fast to choose, 20% of the kids chose A, etc. We're not recommending that that's the only way you check for understanding and build a formative assessment system. But if you don't have this kind of system, then you have to build an error analysis tool. And we put several examples of error analysis tools in. This is from a group project in the U.S. history class. Students were working on a World War II project, and the teacher was walking around as the students were working and listened in on their conversations for common misconceptions and errors. And he put the students' initials in the appropriate period so that he could keep track of it and see who he still needed to reteach. A lot of teachers walk around a classroom. We all do that. We listen to our students, and we like to correct them right then. That's not really teaching. That's not really reorganizing instruction to really get their thinking to be deeper and deeper. We have to learn how to keep track of it so we remember which errors and misconceptions to address later. Here's another example. This is from second grade math. The unit was going to last several weeks, and the teachers in that grade chose to create a proactive error analysis tool to keep track of where student mastery was occurring so they could figure out where they still needed to provide instruction for students. There's another example. This is from an essay. This one was a reactive one. I'll go back. This one is proactive. That left column was done in advance of the instruction. This one was done in reaction to the essays, the writing that students had done. This one highlights a couple things really important to us. Period 3, the teacher's on prep, so don't think that there were no errors. That's a prep period. But look at period 4, supporting evidence. If PowerPoint would let us, you'd see a lot of names scrolling down into where your keyboard would be. There's a lot of students who didn't get, for whatever reason, how to use supporting evidence in their writing. Unfortunately, in many cases, if you don't create an error tool like this, you can't remember where the error is clustered. So you end up reteaching all of the students all day long rather than targeting the error to fourth period and doing something for the whole class fourth period. Yeah, there are 3 students in period 1 who need instruction on this, 2 in period 2 and 4 in period 5. But period 4 needs to be retaught. We call that a global error. At some percentage, it becomes such significant error that we have to reteach the whole class. The others on this page are all targeted errors. There are small groups of students who need instruction. And I don't know about all of you, but 2 days, 3 days later, it is hard to remember which students made which errors, especially when we've handed back their work and their work is now gone. Whether it's in the trash can, recycle can, backpack, on the refrigerator, whatever, it's gone. So we can't figure out what to do. A couple other notes here. The period 1 student and the period 4 student, those are 2 students who have IEPs. And this, I think, has really helped us create a communication system, general ed to special ed, to figure out the curriculum-based errors that students with disabilities are making and how we can address those errors in part of their instruction. And the general ed and special ed teachers talk to each other and say, who's going to take on which kinds of errors? And obviously, I hope you see, the mid-sentence capitalization will be done by the special ed faculty. But what if the special ed teacher wanted to do a lesson on subject-verb agreement with Anthony in period 4 and grab the other students who made that same error and had them in the group while the teacher was working with Anthony? It's really paying off to really analyze the errors and figure out what needs to be taught next. Here's another example from Algebra 2 with imaginary numbers and real numbers. And you can see the patterns of, again, we're seeing things that students need to be retaught. This is something that should be occurring more often, especially in states that are transitioning to like new standards like Common Core or increased expectations in their own state standards. Is how do we pay attention to the various components of that standard and which students haven't mastered it, and then go back and reteach it. So our thinking is that we have to have a framework, that there has to be a system approach to teaching. It's not left for chance. It's not one day's a good instruction, sorry you weren't here, tomorrow's not going to be so good. There is a framework, and that we're very intentional about what we want students to learn and the organizational systems we put in place in the classroom for them to learn. And that our teaching is targeted. It's based on assessment information. We don't just have 180 folders, each with a day's worth of instruction in it. Instead, we are very much targeted based on what students know and don't know, because we have good formative assessment information.
We hope you'll join us in looking more closely at how these different aspects of quality instruction come together. As I've noted earlier, it really is about intentionality, not only in terms of what happens in front of students, but also as we communicate with one another about a shared vision of quality instruction. We'll also explore more deeply as well issues around culture and climate as a way of shaping all of this and really producing some quality instruction. With that, I'd like to turn this over to all of you about questions that you may have, things that you're thinking about, wonderful ideas or connections that you're making as well.
All right, we've had a couple questions that came in during your presentation. If there are others that people have in mind, please submit them now through the questions pane. A couple of them are about your gradual release of responsibility graphic. The first being the significance of the triangle versus the inverted triangle. Can you talk a little bit about that graphic?
Sure. So what we're trying to show way back in 2001, was that there are times where the teacher is doing more of the work. Remember all this? Review, review, review. We're trying to show that there are times when the teacher has more responsibility, and there are times in a lesson when the student has more responsibility. So the two triangles, we're trying to demonstrate the relative workload for a teacher in any given phase of instruction. We're trying to say it's not like students have no responsibility when the teacher's setting the purpose, and there's like no teacher responsibility when students are doing independent work. It's just the responsibility is reduced in those situations. So that's what all we were trying to show with the triangles when we wrote them was relative workload, not a linear order to the lesson.
And another question about that graphic or the concept is how you incorporate your analysis charts with the gradual release of responsibility.
What a great question that is. You'll recall on some of those charts as well, especially when you're grouping them by period, that it gives you an indication of who needs various kinds of instruction. So, for example, and so I apologize. I'm gonna flip all the way through these again. Ready? Hang on. Don't get seasick. But I'd like to put that graphic up so that you can see what I'm referring to as well. So, for example, I'll use this as an example. When I look at period 1, and I see that there are some kids who need some help with colons and semicolons, for example, that gives me an indication of who needs a bit more of that guided instruction, or perhaps even some small group re-instruction or reteaching around all of that. So now as a teacher, I'm making some plans, or I'm understanding where that guided instruction needs to happen. That I don't need to do it with the entire class, but I do need to have some small group instruction that's going on. What typically is going on in the rest of the class is students engaged in some collaborative learning and some independent learning as well, while I'm spending time in a small group with being able to do that instruction. Very often in classrooms, both guided instruction and collaborative instruction or collaborative learning are going on at the same moment in time. As well, sometimes there are three things that are happening at the same moment in time. There may be some independent learning that's going on as well. If you come into a classroom at the school where we work, you'll very often see that occurring. You'll see a teacher with a small group of students doing some guided instruction. You'll see a substantial amount of the rest of the class engaged in some kind of collaborative learning that is not under the direct tutelage of the teacher. And then in many cases, you'll even see some other students who are engaged in some independent learning at the same time. So again, in the same way that we talk about it not being a hierarchy, we also recognize that more than one phase of learning may be occurring at the same moment in time.
And how are learning targets different from student learning objectives?
Oh, that's a great question. Very often, and I think it's how you, for whoever posed that question, how you define student learning targets. I'll tell you what we think about in terms of establishing purpose, and then you can decide if this aligns with your practices as well. When we talk about establishing purpose, very often we have it, first of all, posted in writing somewhere so that the teacher can refer to it and the students can refer to it. It is always, always what it is that the students are supposed to be learning about in that particular lesson. It's not the same learning target that occurs over a period of a couple of days. Here's what I want you to learn about today, and here's what it is that I want you to do with it. We often break it up into 2 or even 3 subcategories by defining what the content objective is, which as teachers, often that's the place that we go to first. What's the language objective, reading, writing, speaking, listening, viewing, some aspect of that, and then in many cases, what the social objective is. This is especially important for younger students as well. And as I said, always focused on a single lesson or a single component of a lesson if you're teaching for longer periods of time. Here's what I want you to learn about today. Here's what it is that I want you to do with it.
The other thing I would add to that is that people use some of this interchangeably. You could say a goal or objective, a learning target, learning intention. We tend to say purpose with students because we want to make sure that whatever that objective, that learning target is relevant for them. And I think that's been the often missing part, that intentionality includes what are you going to learn, what are you going to do with it, but why do you have to learn it?
And I think we'll try to fit in one more question here. For that error list, how do you suggest going about developing that and filling it out while teaching?
So this one was in reaction to the student work that was submitted. So the teacher's logging errors as they come about in the student's writing. This, we only mark on the student's paper the first time we see any error. When it comes up again, it goes on the error log. So in the syllabus, it says, we're not going to mark all the errors we see or mistakes, all the problems on your paper. Instead, we're going to keep a log of them and reteach based on this. So we're not returning work with lots of things that are not marked up. that we didn't notice. We do return stuff that's not all marked up, but we noticed all the errors. And so parents got used to that, oh, they're going to reteach my kid on these formative tools. This one is more developed by a PLC team, a collaborative planning team. As they plan the unit, here are the things they expect students to have problems with that they're building teaching in and they're looking for as the unit progresses.
All right, thank you. I think we're going to close out question and answer right now. Do you have any final remarks?
Well, thank you all for paying attention and hanging out with us. We hope some of you will make it to Chicago to the Fit Teaching 3-Day Institute.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Doug and Nancy. Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry will be presenters at the ASCD Summer Academy on Fit Teaching, a 3-day intensive academy that will help you implement high-quality teaching and learning in your school and district in Chicago, Illinois, July 31st to August 2nd. Go to ascd.org/fitteachingacademy to learn more and register.